fog had come early that November evening, rolling up from the Thames in thick yellowed curtains that swallowed the gaslight whole. In the narrow passage between Dorset Street and Miller's Court, a woman's footsteps echoed against wet cobblestones, the sound muffled by the weight of the mist. She pulled her shawl tighter, though it did little against the cold that crept beneath wool and skin alike. Somewhere in the darkness, a door creaked open. A shadow moved where no shadow should have been. The morning would bring the screams. The morning would bring the constables with their whistles and their pale faces, stumbling backward from what they found in the rented room. But now, in this moment suspended between the last tick of midnight and the first grey light of dawn, the city slept unaware. The killer moved through Whitechapel like smoke through water, leaving no sound, no trace, only the promise of horror yet to be discovered. In the lodging houses, in the doss houses where the desperate paid fourpence for a rope to lean on through the night, no one stirred, no one heard. The fog pressed against every window, every door, as if the city itself had drawn a veil over its own eyes. And then, silence. The kind of silence that comes after something terrible, when even the rats cease their scratching and the night holds its breath. In that stillness, London waited for morning, unknowing that when dawn finally broke, nothing in Whitechapel would ever be the same again. Chapter 1. The Abyss of Whitechapel. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, the world has grown still, and somewhere beyond your window darkness gathers as it has always done. I wonder, dear listener, where do you find yourself tonight? What hour marks your clock as you settle into this moment of rest? Wherever you are, whatever time embraces you, know that you are welcome here. Before we begin our journey backward through the centuries, I ask only one small kindness. If this voice brings you comfort in the dark hours, consider subscribing to this channel that we might continue these nocturnal wanderings together. And now let us drift backward in time to an autumn evening in 1888, to the streets of London's East End, where gaslight flickered against ancient walls and the fog rolled in from the Thames like a living thing. The district of Whitechapel sprawled across the eastern reaches of London like a wound that would not heal. In that year of 1888, when Queen Victoria sat upon her throne in the 49th year of her reign, when the British Empire stretched across continents and the sun never set upon its dominion, this corner of the capital remained stubbornly medieval in its squalor. The grand boulevards of the West End, where carriages rolled past illuminated shop windows and ladies in silk gowns descended from theatres, might have existed in another country entirely. Here, in the narrow passages and courts of Whitechapel, another London breathed and struggled and died, in ways the comfortable classes preferred not to contemplate. The streets bore names that spoke of older times: Dorset Street, Flower and Dean Street, Thrall Street, Fashion Street. But whatever gentility those names once suggested had long since dissolved into memory. Buildings leaned against one another, as if too weary to stand alone, their bricks blackened by decades of coal smoke, their windows patched with rags and newspaper where glass had broken and never been replaced. Between these structures ran alleyways so narrow that two people could barely pass without turning sideways, passages where sunlight never reached even at noon, where the permanent twilight smelled of rotting vegetables, human waste, and the sour tang of cheap gin. In these streets lived 80,000 souls packed into lodging houses and doss houses, where beds were rented by the night or even by the hour. Those who could scrape together fourpence might secure an actual bed, a thin mattress crawling with vermin, shared perhaps with a stranger. Those with only twopence could pay for a place on a bench or for a rope strung across the common room where exhausted labourers leaned forward in sleep, their arms draped over the hemp line, their bodies swaying mentally through the night like hanged men who had not quite finished dying. And those with nothing, those who could not produce even a copper coin, found themselves turned out into the streets at midnight, to walk until dawn or find shelter in doorways, or to sell the only commodity that remained to them. The women of Whitechapel understood this calculus of survival better than most. In the flop houses and common lodging houses, in the courts and passages, thousands of women eked out their existence on the very edge of starvation. Some took in sewing or matchbox making, working 16 hours for a few pennies, their fingers bleeding from the work, their eyes failing in the dim light. Others worked in the factories that lined the commercial road, sorting rags or cleaning animal carcasses, jobs that paid so little a woman could barely afford a bed and a crust of bread from a single day's wages. And when the work ran out, when the pennies could not be found, when the lodging house keeper demanded his fourpence or else the street, many women made the only choice available to them. The prostitutes of Whitechapel numbered in the hundreds, perhaps in the thousands. No one kept accurate count of women so far beneath official notice. They ranged in age from girls of 14 to grandmothers of 60, their faces weathered by hardship, their bodies broken by childbirth and disease and violence. Most were not professional streetwalkers in any organised sense. They were charwomen who could not make the rent, seamstresses whose work had dried up, widows with children to feed, women who had once been respectable but who had fallen through the cracks that riddled the foundation of Victorian society. They walked the streets after dark, approaching men in the shadows, negotiating for pennies in doorways and courts. The transaction was brief, conducted standing against a wall or in some filthy passage, and when it was finished the woman would hurry to the lodging house to secure her bed for the night, or to the gin palace to purchase a few hours of oblivion. The drink consumed Whitechapel as surely as any plague. On every street corner stood a public house, its windows glowing with gaslight, its doors swinging open to release clouds of tobacco smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies and spilled alcohol. Inside, men and women crowded around rough wooden bars, downing pints of beer and glasses of gin that cost a penny and promised temporary escape from the grinding misery of their existence. The gin was adulterated, mixed with turpentine and sulfuric acid to increase its potency, and it destroyed the drinker from the inside with systematic efficiency. Women who had once been pretty aged a decade in a year, men developed the shakes, the liver failure, the madness that came from sustained poisoning. Children grew up watching their parents descend into this liquid hell, and often followed them down the same path. Crime flourished in such soil like mushrooms in a cellar. Pickpockets worked the crowds along Commercial Street and Whitechapel Road, their small fingers dipping into pockets with practiced skill. Burglars scaled walls and jimmied windows, stealing what little the poor possessed from one another. Protection rackets operated openly, demanding payment from shopkeepers and lodging house owners. Violence erupted without warning, knives flashing in arguments over a spilled drink. Men beating their wives bloody in rooms so thin-walled the neighbours could hear every blow. Street fights that left men bleeding in the gutters where they lay until morning. The Metropolitan Police maintained a presence, their constables walking their beats with truncheons and whistles, but they were vastly outnumbered and viewed by the local population with suspicion bordering on hostility. The authorities, such as they were, concerned themselves primarily with maintaining a veneer of order. The workhouse loomed at the edge of the district, that great Victorian solution to poverty, where the destitute could find food and shelter in exchange for crushing labour and the complete surrender of their freedom. Families were separated upon entry, husbands from wives, parents from children, and once inside those walls a person became little more than a prisoner. The threat of the workhouse haunted every conversation, every transaction. Better to starve in the streets than to enter that place. Better to sell oneself 100 times than to wear the workhouse uniform and break rocks until one's hands bled. Disease moved through Whitechapel like a tide. Cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis. These killers required no knife, no gun. They bred in the contaminated water that ran from the pumps, in the overcrowded rooms where 15 people might share space meant for 5, in the malnutrition that left bodies unable to fight the simplest infection. Children died in shocking numbers, their small bodies carried off to paupers' graves. Women died in childbirth, their screams echoing through thin walls while neighbours went about their business. Knowing that nothing could be done, that this was simply the way of things, the old died alone, their bodies sometimes not discovered for days, until the fell became unbearable. Yet amid this darkness, life persisted with stubborn determination. Market vendors hawked their goods along Whitechapel Road, crying out the prices of bruised apples and day-old bread. Street musicians played fiddles and accordions on corners, their tin cups collecting the occasional halfpenny from passers-by. Children played in the streets despite everything, their games incorporating the detritus of poverty, rolling hoops made from old barrel rings, kicking balls fashioned from rags and string. Women gathered at the public pumps to fill their buckets and exchange gossip, their voices rising and falling in the eternal rhythm of neighbourhood conversation. In the Jewish quarter, where immigrants from Russia and Poland had settled in growing numbers, the sound of Yiddish mixed with Cockney English and the smell of baking bread occasionally cut through the general stench. The neighbourhood possessed its own geography of survival, known intimately by its inhabitants. Certain public houses were safer than others. Certain lodging houses had keepers who would occasionally extend credit for a night or two. Certain streets were to be avoided after dark, controlled by gangs who did not welcome strangers. The prostitutes knew which corners were already claimed, which policemen could be reasoned with, which clients were likely to become violent. This knowledge was passed between women in whispered conversations, the oral tradition of survival strategies shared in the dim light of common rooms and on street corners after midnight. No one imagined that something worse was coming. In the summer and early autumn of 1888, Whitechapel suffered under the same miseries it had endured for decades, perhaps for centuries. The newspapers occasionally published sensational accounts of particularly brutal crimes in the East End, but these stories were read primarily as entertainment by comfortable readers in other parts of London, who shook their heads at the savagery of the lower classes and then turned the page to the society announcements. The district had seen murders before. Women had died violently in these streets many times, their bodies found in passages or rooms, their deaths investigated perfunctorily if at all. Another dead prostitute barely warranted a mention in the police reports. But in the darkness of those autumn nights, something was already moving. Someone walked these streets with purpose, observing, planning, selecting. The fog rolled in from the Thames as it always had. The gas lamps flickered against ancient walls. The sounds of drunken arguments and crying children echoed through the passages. Everything appeared as it had always been. Yet beneath the surface of the ordinary, a clock was ticking toward midnight, and when it struck, the name Whitechapel would be spoken with horror from one end of the world to the other. The abyss had always been there, waiting. Soon a saw it would open wide. Chapter 2. The First Crimson Dawn. The night of August 30th passed as so many others had passed in Whitechapel, with the usual sounds of suffering and survival echoing through the narrow streets. In the lodging houses, men and women paid their pennies and claimed their spaces for the night. In the public houses, the gin flowed until closing time, when the doors were bolted and the drinkers stumbled out into the darkness. Along the streets, women walked their beats, approaching shadows that might contain a customer, negotiating their brief transactions in doorways and courts. The fog had lifted somewhat, leaving the air clear enough that the stars could be glimpsed between the chimney pots, though few in Whitechapel had reason to look upward. Mary Ann Nichols had lived 43 years, and every one of them had been hard. She had been married once, had borne 5 children, but the marriage had dissolved in recriminations and alcohol, and her children had been taken from her, or had drifted away into their own struggles. Her face bore the marks of her life, the broken capillaries across her cheeks that spoke of years of drinking, the missing teeth, the premature aging that poverty inflicted upon women of her class. She stood perhaps 5 feet 2 inches tall, a small woman growing stout in middle age, her brown hair already greying. On this night she wore a brown Ulster coat, a new black bonnet that she had been pleased to acquire, and a dress that had been patched and mended many times. She had spent the evening drinking, as she often did, and when the time came to secure her lodging for the night, she found herself without the necessary 4pence. The deputy keeper at the lodging house on Thrall Street knew her well. She had stayed there many times before, but he could not extend credit indefinitely, and business was business. Mary Ann left without argument, making a joke about her new bonnet as she departed. She would earn the money, she said. She had done it before. The streets would provide what she needed, as they always had. It was nearly 1:30 in the morning when she walked out into the night, turning east toward Whitechapel Road. What occupied her thoughts in those final hours? No one would ever know. Perhaps she thought of her children scattered now across London. Perhaps she thought of nothing more than the immediate problem before her, finding a man who would pay for her services, earning the coins that would purchase a bed and perhaps a final glass of gin before sleep. She was seen at 2:30 on the corner of Osborne Street and Whitechapel Road, drunk but steady on her feet, talking to another woman about her new bonnet and her confidence that she would soon have money. She walked east, away from the lights of Whitechapel Road, toward the darker streets where Bucks Row ran through an area of warehouses and workshops that fell silent after dark. Bucks Row was a shabby thoroughfare even by the standards of Whitechapel, lined with terraced houses on one side and the blank walls of warehouses on the other. Few lamps illuminated the street, and those that existed burned with feeble light that barely pushed back the darkness. At this hour, between 3 and 4 in the morning, the street lay in profound silence. The workers who would arrive at dawn to labour in the warehouses had not yet risen. The night shift workers in the few businesses that operated around the clock were occupied inside their buildings. The street belonged to the darkness and to whoever moved through it. Charles Cross walked this route every morning on his way to work at Pickford's, the carriers and removers. He was a carman, up before dawn as his trade required, walking through the dark streets with the resigned determination of a man who had made this journey 1,000 times before. As he approached Bucks Row shortly before 4 o'clock, he noticed what appeared to be a tarpaulin lying against the gated entrance to a stable yard. London's streets were full of such detritus, and he might have walked past without a second glance, except that something about the shape arrested his attention, approached closer, peering through the darkness, and realised that what he was seeing was not canvas, but a woman lying on her back, her skirts pushed up around her waist. His first thought was that she was drunk or unconscious, another common sight in these streets. He moved to within a few feet of her, uncertain whether he should rouse her or simply continue on his way. At that moment, another carman named Robert Paul came walking along Bucks Row, also on his way to work. Cross called out to him, and together they approached the woman. Cross reached down and touched her hand. It was still warm, but she did not respond to his touch. In the darkness, they could not see clearly, but something seemed wrong beyond mere drunkenness. They pulled her skirts down, a gesture of modesty, even in the face of what they did not yet understand, and then hurried off to find a policeman. Police Constable John Neal walked his beat with the mechanical precision that duty required, checking doors, watching for signs of trouble passing the same points at regular intervals. He entered Bucks Row at approximately 3:15 and found nothing amiss. He passed through again shortly before 4 o'clock, and this time he saw her. She lay on her back on the pavement, her head toward the east, her left hand touching the gate beside her. His bull's-eye lantern revealed what the carman had not seen in the darkness. Her throat had been cut so deeply that the vertebrae were visible, the wound extending from ear to ear in a gaping grin that no longer bled because her heart had stopped pumping. The blood had pooled beneath her, running into the gutter, still wet but already beginning to congeal in the cool air. Neil blew his whistle, the shrill sound piercing the silence of the early morning. Other constables came running, and soon a small group of policemen stood around the body, their lanterns casting jumping shadows on the warehouse walls. A doctor was summoned, and Dr. Rhys Llewellyn arrived from his surgery on Whitechapel Road within minutes. He knelt beside the body, making his preliminary examination by the light of the police lanterns. The woman had been dead perhaps 30 minutes, no more. The cuts to the throat were clean and deep, made with a sharp knife by someone who knew how to use it. Her clothing was disturbed, her skirts and petticoats pushed up, though whether by the killer or by those who had found her was unclear. The body was removed to the mortuary at Old Montague Street, a small brick building that served as a dead house for the parish. There, in better light, the full extent of the attack became apparent. The throat wounds were severe enough to have caused almost instant death, but they were not the only injuries. Her abdomen had been stabbed multiple times, the knife driven in with sufficient force to penetrate deep into the tissue. The cuts were rough but purposeful, as if the killer had been searching for something or expressing some dark compulsion that words could not capture. Her few possessions were catalogued: the brown ulster coat, the black bonnet she had been so proud of, a comb, a handkerchief marked with the initials of the Lambeth workhouse. No money was found on her person. Identification came within hours. She was known in the lodging houses, known to the police, known to dozens of people who had seen her face on the streets for years. Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly to her friends and acquaintances, a woman who had spent her adult life sliding down the slope of Victorian respectability into the depths of Whitechapel poverty. The newspapers picked up the story quickly, as they always did with violent crime in the East End. The murder was sensational enough to warrant attention. A woman butchered in the street with a savagery that seemed excessive even for a district where violence was common. But London had seen murders before, many murders, and the death of a prostitute in Whitechapel was not particularly shocking to readers who lived in more comfortable quarters. The investigation proceeded as such investigations did. Police questioned the residents of the houses near Bucks Row, seeking anyone who had heard screams or seen a suspicious person fleeing the scene. No one had heard anything. No one had seen anything. In a neighbourhood where people learned early to mind their own business, where the police were not always viewed as protectors, witnesses were difficult to find even when they existed. The inquest was held at the Working Lads Institute in Whitechapel Road, where a jury of local men heard the evidence and delivered their verdict. Mary Ann Nichols had been murdered by a person or persons unknown. The police would continue their investigations. Anyone with information was encouraged to come forward. The newspapers published their accounts, some with gruesome details, some with moralising commentary about the degraded state of the East End and the need for social reform. And then, as these things usually went, the story began to fade from the front pages. Other news competed for attention. The murder of Polly Nichols became another file in the growing archives of unsolved crimes. But in the lodging houses and on the street corners of Whitechapel, the women who walked the night shifts spoke to one another in low voices. The manner of the killing troubled them in ways they could not quite articulate. The ferocity of it, the intimate violence, the fact that it had happened so quickly and so silently that no one heard anything. These details circulated through the neighbourhood like a dark rumour. They had all known violence from men, had all experienced the casual brutality that came with their trade. But this felt different. This felt purposeful in a way that frightened them more than simple rage or drunken cruelty. The fog rolled in again as September began, thick and yellow, carrying the smell of the river and the smoke of 10,000 coal fires. The gas lamps glowed like dim moons in the murk, and the streets became corridors of shadow where nothing could be seen clearly beyond a few feet. In this atmosphere, perfect for concealment, the women of Whitechapel went about their business because they had no choice. The rent was still due, the lodging house keepers still demanded their fourpence, and if the streets were more dangerous now than they had been before, well, they had always been dangerous. A woman learned to be careful, to watch for the warning signs, to trust her instincts about which men were safe and which were not. But instincts could only protect so far, and in the darkness gathering over Whitechapel, something waited that no instinct could predict or prevent. The first crimson dawn had broken. Others would follow. Chapter 3. The pattern emerges. 8 days passed between the death of Mary Ann Nichols and the morning of September 8th, when London woke to discover that the killer had struck again. 8 days during which the police pursued their inquiries without result, during which the newspapers gradually allowed the story to drift from prominence, during which life in Whitechapel continued in its usual patterns of desperation and survival. The lodging houses filled each night, the public houses emptied their kegs, the women walked the streets in the hours after midnight, negotiating their transactions in the shadows, earning enough for a bed or a drink or a loaf of bread. The memory of Polly Nichols remained, but memory was not enough to fill an empty stomach or pay for a night's shelter. Annie Chapman had reached the age of 47, and the years had used her harshly. She had been born Eliza Ann Smith, had married a coachman named John Chapman, had borne 3 children. The marriage had been respectable, even comfortable by working-class standards, but it had dissolved in the way such marriages often did, through drink and discord and the slow erosion of whatever affection had once existed between husband and wife. They had separated, and John had paid her an allowance of 10 shillings a week, enough to keep her from absolute destitution. But John Chapman had died in 1886, and with his death the allowance ceased, and Annie found herself adrift in London, with no resources and no prospects. She had tried to survive through various means. She sold flowers and matches on the streets. She did crochet work when she could find materials and customers. She took up with a man who worked as a sieve maker, living with him in a common lodging house on Dorset Street, the most notorious thoroughfare in all of Whitechapel. But that relationship too had ended, and by the autumn of 1888 she was alone, moving between lodging houses, drinking heavily, her health failing from the tuberculosis that was slowly destroying her lungs. She was known to the other residents of the lodging houses as Dark Annie, a reference to her complexion and her dark wavy hair. Those who knew her described her as intelligent when sober, but the periods of sobriety grew shorter as the disease progressed and the drinking increased. The night of September 7th found Annie without money for a bed. She had been ill for days, barely able to walk, and she had spent what little money she possessed on drink rather than food or shelter. The deputy keeper at the lodging house at 35 Dorset Street, a man named Timothy Donovan, knew her well. She had lived there on and off for months, but at just past midnight, when she appeared in his office unable to pay, he could not make exceptions. The other residents would hear of it, and then everyone would expect credit, and the business would collapse. Annie did not argue. She was weak and sick, swaying on her feet, but she managed to smile as she left. She would be back with the money soon, she said. Do not let her bed to anyone else. She was seen at various points through the night, moving slowly through the streets, speaking to acquaintances, attempting to summon the strength to do what needed to be done. At 5:30 in the morning, a woman named Elizabeth Long walked past the house at number 29 Hanbury Street, a run-down building that housed multiple families and a small workshop. She saw Annie Chapman standing on the pavement talking to a man. Elizabeth Long noticed them because they were standing close together, clearly negotiating something, and the man's back was to her, so she could not see his face. She heard Annie say no, and then heard the man say something in reply, but she could not make out the words. The man appeared to be wearing dark clothing and a deerstalker hat, and he seemed to be of foreign appearance, though what that meant precisely Elizabeth Long would struggle to articulate at the inquest. She walked on without looking back, and that was the last time anyone admitted to seeing Annie Chapman alive. Number 29 Hanbury Street contained 17 residents, spread across its cramped rooms and corridors. The building had a narrow passage that ran from the front door through to a backyard, a small enclosed space perhaps 15 feet square, bounded by wooden fencing on 3 sides and the back of the house on the 4th. Access to this yard was unrestricted. Anyone could walk through the passage from the street, and the residents used the yard for various purposes, hanging laundry or simply stepping outside for air. At 6 o'clock in the morning, an elderly resident named John Davis descended the stairs from his 3rd-floor room, intending to use the outdoor privy in the yard. He walked through the passage and stepped out into the sea-grey morning light. Annie Chapman lay on her back between the steps and the fence, her head toward the house, her face turned toward the fence. John Davis stood frozen for a moment, his mind unable to process what his eyes were seeing, and then he turned and ran back through the passage into the street, crying out for help. Within minutes a crowd had gathered, and the police were summoned. The first constable to arrive, unable to immediately enter the crowded passage, climbed the fence from the adjoining property and dropped down into the yard. What he saw there would haunt him for the rest of his days. The killer had taken his time. That much became immediately apparent. Annie's throat had been cut in the same manner as Mary Ann Nichols, slashed so deeply that the head was nearly severed from the body. But the abdominal mutilations were far more extensive. Her abdomen had been opened entirely, the intestines drawn out and placed across her left shoulder. Her uterus and sections of her bladder had been removed and taken away. The doctor who examined the body would later testify that these organs were absent and could not be found at the scene. The precision of these removals, the anatomical knowledge required to locate and extract specific organs, suggested something that chilled the investigators more than simple savagery. This was not the random slashing of a maniac. This was purposefully controlled, done by someone who understood the structure of the human body. Items from Annie's pockets had been arranged near her feet, 2 combs and a piece of muslin, laid out neatly as if the killer wanted them to be found. A leather apron lay near the water pump in the yard, though whether it had been left by the killer or had been there previously, no one could say with certainty. Several brass rings that Annie had worn on her fingers were missing, though they were of no monetary value, mere trinkets that any pawnbroker would have refused. The yard itself showed signs of the struggle, or perhaps of the killer's work. Blood had splashed against the fence in a spray pattern that suggested arterial spurts. The news spread through Whitechapel like fire through dry timber. By mid-morning, crowds had gathered in Hanbury Street, pressing against the police barriers, straining to see into the passage where the horror had occurred. The newspapers sent their reporters scrambling to gather details, and by evening the story dominated the front pages across London. 2 women murdered within 9 days, both in the same district, both killed in the same manner, both mutilated with what appeared to be the same hand. The deaths of Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman were no longer separate incidents. They were connected, part of a pattern, evidence of someone who was hunting in the streets of Whitechapel with a specific purpose. The police investigation intensified immediately. Detectives from Scotland Yard descended upon the East End, interviewing hundreds of people, pursuing dozens of theories. The leather apron found in the yard led them to a boot finisher named John Pizer, known locally as Leather Apron, who had a reputation for intimidating prostitutes. He was arrested, held, questioned extensively, and then released when his alibi proved unshakable. He had been elsewhere when Annie Chapman died, with witnesses who could account for his whereabouts, but the nickname stuck, and newspapers began referring to the killer as Leather Apron, creating the first of many false identities that would be attached to the murderer. Dr. George Bagster Phillips conducted the post-mortem examination, and his testimony at the inquest provided details that both fascinated and horrified the public. The killer had used a sharp knife, probably 6 to 8 inches in length. The cuts showed some degree of anatomical knowledge, though whether this indicated a doctor, a butcher, or simply someone with practical experience in cutting flesh, Phillips could not say with certainty. The removal of the organs had been done quickly, but not carelessly. Whoever did this had known what they were looking for and how to extract it. The entire attack, from the cutting of the throat to the final mutilations, had probably taken no more than 15 minutes, possibly less. 15 minutes in a backyard accessible from the street, with 17 people sleeping in the house above, with daylight approaching and workers beginning to move through the streets. The audacity of it stunned the investigators. The killer had not fled immediately after cutting Annie's throat. He had remained with the body, working methodically, arranging his terrible tableau, and then departed without being seen or heard. Either he possessed extraordinary luck, or he understood the rhythms of the neighbourhood so perfectly that he knew exactly when he could work undisturbed. The women of Whitechapel understood the implications immediately. 2 murders, both of prostitutes, both committed in the early morning hours when women were most vulnerable. The details reported in the newspapers, the mutilations, the missing organs, suggested something beyond common violence. Men had killed prostitutes before, strangled them or stabbed them in rage or drunken fury. But this was different. This was someone who killed for reasons that had nothing to do with passion or anger. This was cold, purposeful, surgical. And he was still out there, walking the same streets they walked, invisible among the crowds. The terror began to spread like a contagion. Women who had walked the streets alone for years now sought companions, pairing up for safety. The lodging houses reported increased occupancy as women scraped together the pennies necessary to avoid sleeping outdoors. The public houses buzzed with speculation and rumour. Vigilance committees formed, groups of local men who patrolled the streets after dark, challenging strangers, watching for suspicious behaviour. The police presence increased dramatically, with constables assigned to the East End in numbers never seen before. But the district was a warren of narrow streets and dark passages, and no number of policemen could watch every corner simultaneously. The pattern had emerged. The method was clear. And somewhere in the darkness of Whitechapel, the killer walked free, his identity unknown. His face lost among the thousands who moved through those streets every day. The newspapers christened him with various names, but none had yet captured the imagination of the public. That would come soon enough. For now, he remained a shadow, a shape glimpsed at the edge of vision, a presence that transformed every dark alley into a potential killing ground. September moved forward into its second week, and the city held its breath, waiting for the next crimson dawn. Chapter 4. The Double Event. The streets of Whitechapel existed in a state of heightened tension as September progressed toward its final week. The murder of Annie Chapman had confirmed what the death of Mary Ann Nichols had suggested. Someone was hunting women in the East End with methodical purpose. The newspapers published columns of speculation and theory. The police pursued their investigations with mounting frustration, following leads that dissolved into nothing, interviewing suspects who proved to have alibis or no connection to the crimes. And still the women walked the streets after dark because hunger does not pause for fear, and the rent must be paid whether a killer stalks the neighbourhood or not. The weather had turned cold for late September, with rain falling intermittently and fog rolling in from the Thames to blanket the streets in thick grey curtains. The gas lamps glowed like dim stars in the murk, their light swallowed by the moisture-laden air within a few feet of their posts. Visibility dropped to nearly nothing after midnight. When the legitimate businesses closed and the streets belonged to those who had nowhere else to go. In this atmosphere, perfect for concealment, the killer had operated twice already. The police increased their patrols, but the fog defeated even their best efforts. A man could stand 10 feet away and remain invisible. A scream could echo from any direction, distorted by the walls and the weather, until its source became impossible to pinpoint. Elizabeth Stride had reached the age of 44, though she often claimed to be younger. She had been born Elizabeth Gustafsdotter in Sweden, had come to London as a young woman, had worked as a domestic servant and then as a prostitute as circumstances required. She had married a carpenter named John Stride, and they had operated a coffee shop together on Crisp Street, a modest establishment that catered to working men. But John Stride had died in 1884, and the coffee shop had closed, and Elizabeth found herself alone once more, drifting through the lodging houses of the East End, taking men when she needed money, drinking when she had any pennies to spare. Those who knew her described her as quiet and well-spoken, more refined in manner than many of the women who worked the streets. She still carried traces of her Swedish accent, though her English was fluent. She was nearly 5 feet 3 inches tall, with curly dark hair and a pale complexion. On the night of September 30th, she wore a black jacket and skirt, both old but clean, and a checked silk scarf around her neck. She had been living at a lodging house on Flower and Dean Street, paying her 4pence each night when she could, sleeping outdoors when she could not. The evening had been spent drinking and socialising, as such evenings often were. She was seen at various public houses, speaking with acquaintances, nursing her drinks to make them last. Shortly before midnight, she was observed in Berner Street, a narrow thoroughfare that ran south from Commercial Road toward the railway arches. Berner Street was largely residential, lined with small shops and workshops on the ground floors and cramped apartments above. At number 40, the International Working Men's Educational Club occupied a 2-story building where Jewish socialists and anarchists gathered for meetings and discussions. On this night, a social evening was underway, with singing and debate continuing past midnight. At 1 o'clock in the morning, Louis Dimschutz drove his pony cart into Dutfield's yard, the narrow passage that ran beside the club building to the yard behind. Dimschutz was the steward of the club, returning from a day spent selling costume jewellery at the market. His pony shied suddenly as it entered the passage, refusing to go forward. Dimschutz peered into the darkness, unable to see clearly, and poked with his whip at what he thought might be a bundle of clothing lying against the wall. The bundle did not move. He climbed down from his cart, struck a match, and in the brief flare of light saw Elizabeth Stride lying on her side, blood still flowing from the terrible wound across her throat. He ran into the club, shouting for help, and within moments men came pouring out into the passage. Someone ran for the police, and within minutes constables arrived, followed shortly by Dr. Frederick Blackwell, who lived nearby on Commercial Road. The doctor noted the time as precisely 1:16 when he arrived at the scene. Elizabeth Stride lay on her left side, her legs drawn up slightly, her left hand still clutching a packet of cashews, breath-freshening lozenges that suggested she had been preparing for a customer. Her throat had been cut, deeply and decisively, severing the windpipe and the major blood vessels, but there were no abdominal mutilations. Her clothing was undisturbed. Apart from the throat wound, she was unmarked. The police immediately recognised the signature of the killer, the deep throat cut, the targeting of a prostitute in the early morning hours. But the absence of mutilations troubled them. Had Dimschutz interrupted the killer before he could complete his work? The blood was still flowing when the body was discovered, suggesting that the murder had occurred only moments before, perhaps even as the pony cart entered the passage. If so, the killer had fled into the night with his work unfinished, his ritual incomplete. And if that were the case, if he had been denied the full expression of whatever compulsion drove him, what would he do next? The answer came with horrifying swiftness. While the police secured the scene in Dutfield's yard and began their investigation of Elizabeth Stride's murder, a second woman was dying less than a mile away in Mitre Square. The square was located just inside the boundary of the City of London, technically outside the jurisdiction of the Metropolitan Police who patrolled Whitechapel. The City of London Police maintained their own force, and one of their constables, Edward Watkins, walked a beat that took him through Mitre Square every 15 minutes. He had passed through at approximately 1:30 in the morning and found the square empty. When he returned at 1:45, he found Catherine Eddowes. She lay in the southwest corner of the square, in the darkest section away from the gas lamps. Her body had been positioned on its back, legs extended, arms by her sides, and the killer had finally been given the time he needed. The mutilations were extensive beyond anything seen before. Her throat had been cut, her face had been slashed repeatedly, her nose nearly severed, her right earlobe cut through. Her abdomen had been opened from sternum to groin, the intestines pulled out and placed over her right shoulder. Her left kidney and her uterus had been removed and taken away. Pieces of her clothing had been cut off and arranged near the body. The entire attack, from the cutting of the throat to the final mutilations, had been accomplished in under 15 minutes, the interval between the constable's patrols. Catherine Eddowes had been 46 years old, a woman whose life had followed the familiar downward trajectory of poverty and drink. She had been born Catherine Conway, had lived with a man named Thomas Conway for many years, and borne him 3 children. But that relationship had ended in the way such relationships often did. For the past 7 years she had lived with a man named John Kelly, a market porter, in a lodging house on Flower and Dean Street. They had spent the previous few days in the countryside, hop-picking in Kent, but had returned to London with empty pockets and no prospects. On the night of September 30th, Catherine had been arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct and had been held in the Bishopsgate police station until she sobered. She was released at 1 o'clock in the morning and walked out into the night, turning toward Mitre Square. Why she went there, no one could say. Perhaps she was taking a shortcut. Perhaps she met someone who suggested they go there. The square was quiet and dark away from the main thoroughfares, the sort of place where a prostitute might conduct her business without interference. At some point between 1:30 and 1:45, she encountered the killer. What words passed between them? What transaction was negotiated? What promise or pretense drew her into that darkest corner of the square? All of this remained unknown. The deed was done in silence. No one heard screams. No one saw anything suspicious. When Constable Watkins returned on his beat, Catherine Eddowes had already been transformed into a grotesque arrangement of flesh and blood, the killer's canvas finally completed without interruption. The news reached the police investigating the Stride murder within the hour. 2 murders in one night, separated by less than an hour and less than a mile. The pattern had been building, Nichols, Chapman, but now it had become something more. This was not opportunistic violence. This was a campaign, a series, a demonstration of the killer's ability to strike at will despite increased police presence and public vigilance. And the second murder suggested something that chilled the investigators to their core. The killer had been interrupted in Dutfield's yard, had fled with his work incomplete, and had immediately sought another victim to finish what he had started. The investigation exploded in multiple directions simultaneously. The city police and the Metropolitan Police coordinated their efforts, comparing evidence from both scenes, interviewing everyone who'd been in the vicinity of either murder. In Dutfield's yard, the members of the Working Men's Educational Club were questioned extensively. Had anyone seen a man fleeing the scene? Had anyone noticed suspicious behaviour earlier on in the evening? In Mitre Square, every resident of the surrounding buildings was interviewed. A few reported hearing cries in the night, but nothing they considered alarming. Sounds were common in these neighbourhoods, and people learned not to investigate every disturbance. The most promising lead came from 3 men, Joseph Lawender, Joseph Hyam Levy, and Harry Harris, who had left the Imperial Club on Duke Street at 1:30 in the morning. As they walked toward Mitre Square, they saw a man and woman talking at the entrance to Church Passage, which led into the square. The woman had her hand on the man's chest, and they appeared to be engaged in conversation. The witnesses paid little attention at the time, but later they realised they had probably seen Catherine Eddowes moments before her death. Their descriptions of the man were vague and contradictory. He was of medium height, wearing dark clothing, possibly a cap, appearing to be in his 30s. Nothing about him had seemed particularly suspicious or memorable. As news of the double murder spread through London, the public reaction shifted from concern to panic. The newspapers ran sensational headlines, printing every gruesome detail the police would confirm, and inventing others when confirmation was not forthcoming. Theories proliferated wildly. The killer was a doctor, a butcher, a foreign sailor, an escaped lunatic, a member of the aristocracy indulging perverted appetites. Some claimed the murders were ritual killings connected to Jewish mysticism. Others insisted the killer was a gang, not a single person operating for mysterious purposes. The anti-immigrant sentiment that had been simmering in the East End boiled over, with mobs attacking foreigners in the streets, particularly Jews, who made convenient scapegoats. The police found themselves under intense pressure from every direction. The Home Office demanded results. The newspapers criticised their incompetence. The Vigilance Committees accused them of negligence. And still the killer remained free, his identity unknown, his face invisible among the thousands who walk the streets of Whitechapel each day. Additional constables were deployed. Detectives worked around the clock following leads. Suspects were arrested, questioned, released when their alibis held. But the investigation produced no breakthrough, no clear direction toward the truth. In the lodging houses and on the street corners, the women of Whitechapel spoke in whispers about the double event. 2 murders in one night demonstrated a terrible truth. The killer was not satisfied, not finished, not deterred by the increased police presence or the public attention. He would kill again, and when he did, it would be worse than before. The pattern had been established. The escalation was clear. Somewhere in the fog-shrouded streets, the killer moved with impunity, selecting his victims, planning his next demonstration. The night had become a hunting ground, and every woman who walked the streets after dark understood that she might be chosen next. The fog rolled in thicker than before, swallowing the gas lamps, turning the streets into corridors of shadow where nothing could be seen clearly. And in that darkness, something waited with infinite patience, ready to strike again when the moment was right. Chapter 5. Letters from Hell. The morning after the double murder brought a deluge of rain that washed the blood from the cobblestones, but could not cleanse the terror from the streets of Whitechapel. The newspapers published extra editions, their headlines screaming across the front pages in letters so large they could be read from across the street. 2 women murdered in a single night, the killer striking with impunity despite the presence of police and vigilance committees. The East End transformed into a landscape of fear, where every shadow held potential menace and every stranger became a suspect. The city demanded answers, demanded action, demanded that someone be held accountable for the horror that had descended upon London. The police headquarters at Scotland Yard received an unprecedented volume of correspondence in the days following the double event. Letters arrived by every post, dozens each day, from concerned citizens offering theories, from amateur detectives proposing solutions, from mediums claiming psychic knowledge of the killer's identity, from cranks and lunatics seeking attention. The detectives assigned to the case had to sift through this mountain of paper, searching for anything that might constitute a genuine lead while discarding the obvious fabrications and delusions. Most letters were signed with real names and addresses, some were anonymous, and a few were signed with a name that would become more famous than any of the victims, more enduring than the actual identity of the killer. The first letter to bear that signature arrived at the Central News Agency on September the 27th, 3 days before the double murder. It was written in red ink on lined paper, the handwriting neat and controlled despite the supposedly frenzied state of mind it claimed to represent. The letter began with a casual greeting, as if the writer were addressing a friend rather than announcing himself as a murderer. The tone was mocking, boastful, filled with dark humour and barely concealed contempt for the police and their inability to catch him. The writer claimed responsibility for the murders of Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman. He expressed disappointment that the police had not caught him yet, suggesting that they were incompetent fools chasing shadows while he walked freely among them. He promised to continue his work, to send the police the ears of his next victim, to write again once he had dispatched more women to their deaths. And he signed the letter with a name that would echo through history, a name that transformed a series of unsolved murders into legend. He signed it Jack the Ripper. The staff at the Central News Agency initially treated the letter as they treated most such correspondence, as a hoax, another attempt by someone seeking attention to insert themselves into the ongoing drama. Jack the Ripper. The name sounded theatrical and the sort of thing a playwright might devise for a penny dreadful villain. They filed the letter away and thought little more of it. But when news of the double murder reached them on the morning of October the 1st, they reconsidered. The letter had arrived before the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, yet it had promised more deaths. The coincidence seemed too remarkable to ignore. They forwarded the letter to Scotland Yard and contacted the newspapers, and by evening the contents had been published across London. The public reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. Jack the Ripper. The name captured something essential about the murders in a way that no previous designation had managed. It was specific yet mysterious, threatening yet almost comical, a name that could be whispered in fear or shouted in dark humour. The newspapers seized upon it immediately, printing the letter in full, analysing every word, speculating about what sort of man would write such a thing. Was it genuine? Had the killer truly written to taunt the police? Or was this merely another hoax, one that happened to coincide with the murders through chance, rather than actual knowledge? A second letter arrived at the Central News Agency on October 1st, postmarked from the East End. This one was written on a postcard rather than paper, and the handwriting matched the first letter closely enough to suggest the same author. The message was brief and even more disturbing than the first. The writer referred to the double murder, claiming credit for both deaths. He mentioned that he had not had time to remove the ears from the victims as he had previously promised, suggesting that he had been interrupted in his work. And he signed this message with the same name, Jack the Ripper, followed by a postscript that would become infamous. He wrote that the murders would soon be referred to as the double event, using that exact phrase before it had appeared in any newspaper. This second communication, arriving immediately after the murders and containing details that seemed to indicate inside knowledge, convinced many that the letters were genuine. The police were less certain. The details mentioned in the postcard, the double murder, the lack of time, were all things that had been widely reported in the newspapers by the time the card was written. Anyone could have read about the murders and composed a letter claiming responsibility. The handwriting appeared educated, the spelling was correct, the tone was calculated rather than genuinely unhinged. These factors suggested someone intelligent and literate, someone who understood how to craft a message for maximum effect. But genuine or false, the letters had an immediate impact. The name Jack the Ripper displaced all previous designations. He was no longer Leather Apron or the Whitechapel murderer. He was Jack, a common English name that could belong to anyone, combined with Ripper, a word that perfectly captured the nature of his crimes. The name humanized him in a strange way, made him seem almost approachable, a character rather than a faceless terror. And this was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all, the transformation of a brutal killer into a figure who could be discussed, analysed, even joked about in the public houses and on the street corners. More letters began arriving, dozens of them, all signed with variations of the same name. Jack the Ripper, Jack, yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Some were obvious forgeries written in different hands, containing details that contradicted known facts about the murders. Others were more carefully crafted, mimicking the style of the original letters, attempting to convince the authorities of their authenticity. The police found themselves drowning in correspondence, forced to investigate each letter no matter how unlikely its source, because ignoring a genuine communication from the killer would be unforgivable. One letter in particular stood apart from the others, arriving at the home of George Lusk on October the 16th. Lusk was the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a group of local businessmen and residents who had organised patrols of the district in an attempt to catch the killer or at least provide some measure of protection to the women who walked the streets at night. The letter was brief and written in a different hand than the previous Jack the Ripper correspondence. But it came with something that elevated it beyond all the other hoaxes and forgeries. It came with a package. Inside a small cardboard box, preserved in spirits, was half of a human kidney. The letter claimed that the writer had taken the kidney from one of the women he had killed, had fried and eaten the other half, and was now sending this portion to Lusk as proof of his identity. The tone was crude and semi-literate, very different from the educated voice of the previous letters, but the kidney itself could not be dismissed as easily as mere words on paper. Lusk took the package to Dr. Thomas Openshaw at the London hospital, who examined the organ and determined that it was indeed a human kidney and that it had been removed recently, possibly within the previous few weeks. The question immediately arose, was this the kidney taken from Catherine Eddowes? Her left kidney had been removed by the killer and taken from the scene. Could this be that same organ, or was it obtained from some other source? Dr. Openshaw could not say with certainty. The kidney showed signs of disease consistent with the chronic alcoholism that had afflicted Eddowes, but such disease was common among the poor of London, and obtaining a kidney from a hospital or morgue would not have been impossible for someone determined to create a convincing hoax. The letter became known as the From Hell letter, after its return address, and the kidney became one of the most analysed pieces of evidence in the entire case. But whether genuine or false, the letters achieved their purpose. They kept the murders in the public consciousness, transformed the killer from an unknown criminal into a personality, a character with a voice and a style. The newspapers published every new letter, analysing the handwriting, speculating about the author's identity, printing expert opinions from graphologists and alienists. The police found their investigation complicated by this flood of communication, forced to pursue theories about who might have written the letters, rather than focusing solely on physical evidence from the crime scenes. The psychological impact on Whitechapel was profound. The women who walked the streets understood that they were not simply potential victims of a nameless killer. They were potential characters in an ongoing narrative, targets of someone who wrote letters and signed them with a theatrical name, someone who took pride in his work and wanted the world to know about it. This personalization of the threat made it somehow more real and more terrifying. A faceless murderer could be imagined as a monster, something inhuman and therefore separate from ordinary life. But Jack the Ripper, with his letters and his dark humour, was clearly human, clearly intelligent, clearly moving among the population with ease. The vigilance committees intensified their efforts, patrolling the streets in greater numbers, stopping and questioning anyone who seemed suspicious. The police increased their presence yet again, with constables stationed on nearly every corner after dark. But the district was vast, the population dense, and the killer had demonstrated repeatedly that he could strike without being seen or heard. The fog that rolled in each evening provided perfect cover, transforming familiar streets into alien landscapes where visibility dropped to a few feet and sounds became distorted and directionless. In the lodging houses, the women spoke about the letters in hushed tones. Some believed they were genuine, evidence that the killer was educated, perhaps a gentleman slumming in the East End for his terrible pleasures. Others insisted they were hoaxes, cruel jokes played by people with nothing better to do than torment those already living in fear. But regardless of their authenticity, the letters had an effect. They made the killer real in a new way, gave him a voice and a personality that transcended the simple fact of the murders. He was no longer just a threat, he was Jack, and everyone in London knew his name. The weather turned colder as October progressed, with rain falling more frequently and the fog growing thicker. The streets emptied earlier each evening as people hurried home before dark, unwilling to risk the passages and courts where death might be waiting. The prostitutes of Whitechapel faced an impossible choice: stay indoors and starve, or venture out and risk becoming the next victim. Most chose to venture out because a hunger and cold were certainties while the killer was only a possibility, no matter how terrible. The letters continued to arrive throughout October, though none contained the same apparent authenticity as the first communications. The police investigated each one, following up on any detail that might lead to the writer's identification, but the trails always ended in frustration. The original letters had been postmarked from the East End suggesting someone local, but that narrowed the field of suspects hardly at all when tens of thousands lived in the district. The handwriting analysis produced no matches with any known criminals. The red ink used in the first letter was common and available at any stationer's shop. Every lead dissolved into nothing. And while the police chased letters and investigated suspects who all proved to have alibis, or no connection to the crimes, while the newspapers filled their columns with speculation and theory, while the public debated whether Jack the Ripper was a doctor or a butcher or a foreign madman, the real killer walked the streets of Whitechapel, watching and waiting. The letters, whether he had written them or not, had accomplished something remarkable. They had given him immortality, transformed him from a criminal into a legend. The name would outlast the victims, outlast the investigators, outlast the city itself. Jack the Ripper had become eternal, and the darkness he represented would never fully lift from the streets where he had hunted. The fog pressed against the windows of the lodging houses, and somewhere in that grey murk, something waited for its moment to strike again. Chapter 6. The investigation falters. The investigation into the Whitechapel murders had become the largest police operation in the history of London, consuming resources and manpower on a scale never before devoted to a criminal case. Detectives from Scotland Yard worked alongside the City of London Police, coordinating their efforts, sharing information, pursuing hundreds of leads simultaneously. Constables walked their beats in unprecedented numbers, their presence visible on nearly every street corner after dark. The Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Charles Warren, faced intense pressure from the Home Office, from the newspapers, who were members of Parliament demanding to know why the most sophisticated police force in the world could not catch a single murderer. The problem was not lack of effort or resources. The problem was the nature of the crimes themselves and the environment in which they occurred. The killer struck without warning, selected victims who were vulnerable and unlikely to be missed immediately, worked with such speed and silence that no one witnessed the attacks, and vanished into the crowded streets of the East End before the bodies were discovered. He left no weapon, no distinctive evidence, no clear motive that might point toward his identity, and he operated in a district where thousands of men matched the vague descriptions provided by the few witnesses who had seen anyone near the crime scenes. The investigative approach followed multiple paths simultaneously. The police compiled detailed descriptions from witnesses, though these descriptions varied wildly and often contradicted one another. Some described a man of medium height, others claimed he was tall or short. Some said he wore dark clothing, others remembered light-coloured garments. Some witnesses thought he appeared Jewish or foreign, others insisted he looked thoroughly English. Age estimates ranged from 25 to 45. The only consistent element was that he was male, but even this became subject to speculation when some theorists suggested the killer might be a woman disguised as a man, able to approach the victims without arousing suspicion. The police questioned thousands of people, residents of the buildings near the murder sites, frequenters of the public houses where the victims had been seen, lodging housekeepers who might have noticed suspicious tenants, medical professionals who might have the anatomical knowledge suggested by the mutilations. They investigated butchers and slaughtermen, reasoning that someone accustomed to cutting flesh might possess the necessary skills. They examined the records of asylums, searching for recently released patients who might have violent tendencies. They monitored the docks, looking for foreign sailors whose ships had been in port during the murders. Every avenue was pursued with diligence, and every avenue led nowhere. One theory that gained considerable traction suggested the killer was a medical man, perhaps a doctor or a surgeon. The precision of the mutilations, the apparent anatomical knowledge required to locate and remove specific organs, the speed with which the work was accomplished, all of this pointed towards someone with medical training. But when the police investigated doctors who lived or worked in the East End, when they examined the records of medical schools for students who might have demonstrated concerning behaviour, when they interviewed hospital staff about colleagues who seemed suspicious, they found nothing concrete. Dozens of doctors lived and worked in Whitechapel, treating the poor in charity hospitals and dispensaries, and any of them could have possessed the necessary knowledge. But knowledge alone was not evidence, and not a single medical professional could be connected to the murders through anything more substantial than speculation. The Jewish community of the East End came under particular scrutiny, much of it driven by prejudice rather than evidence. The East End had seen a massive influx of Jewish immigrants in recent decades, refugees from pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe, and this foreign population became a convenient target for suspicion. Some theories suggested the murders were ritual killings connected to Jewish religious practices, despite the fact that such theories had no basis in reality and were denounced by anyone with actual knowledge of Jewish customs. Nevertheless, the police investigated several Jewish suspects, including a hairdresser named Aaron Kosminski who suffered from mental illness, and a Polish Jew called Severin Klusowski, who would later be executed for poisoning multiple wives. But no evidence connected either man to the Whitechapel murders at the time, and the investigations led to nothing. Another line of inquiry focused on the slaughterhouses and animal markets that dotted the East End. Someone who worked in such an environment would be accustomed to blood, would know how to use a knife efficiently, would have access to sharp blades, and might have developed the skills necessary for the mutilations. The police interviewed slaughtermen and butchers, examined their knives, investigated their backgrounds and alibis for the nights of the murders. Once again, the theory seemed promising, but the reality proved frustrating. Hundreds of men worked in these trades, and the skills they possessed were common rather than distinctive. No clear suspect emerged from these investigations. The theory that the killer might be a member of the upper classes, a gentleman seeking perverse thrills in the slums, captured the imagination of many. This idea suggested that the killer could afford to travel to and from Whitechapel without living there, could return to respectable lodgings after his crimes where he would never be suspected. Various names were whispered in connection with this theory, including members of the royal family, though these suggestions were based entirely on rumour and had no foundation in fact. The police investigated such theories when specific names were provided, but they found no evidence to support the idea that the killer came from outside the East End. Inspector Frederick Aberline led much of the investigation on the ground, coordinating with local police, interviewing witnesses, following up on leads. He was a methodical man who had worked in the East End for years and understood the district and its inhabitants. But even his experience and dedication produced no breakthrough. The case files grew thicker with each passing week: witness statements, suspect interviews, autopsy reports, maps of the crime scenes, copies of the letters claiming to be from Jack the Ripper. Everything was documented, analysed, cross-referenced, and yet no pattern emerged that pointed clearly toward a specific individual. The use of bloodhounds was proposed as a possible solution. The theory was that dogs trained to track human scent might be able to follow the killer's trail from the crime scene, leading the police directly to his location, or at least providing some indication of the direction he'd fled. 2 bloodhounds were borrowed and brought to the East End for trials, but the dogs proved ineffective in the urban environment, confused by the multitude of overlapping scents, unable to distinguish one person's trail from another's in streets where thousands walked each day. The bloodhound plan was quietly abandoned. The police also attempted to use photography, a relatively new technology, to document the crime scenes and the victims. The bodies were photographed in the mortuary, gruesome images that were kept from the public but studied by investigators for any clues they might reveal. The scenes themselves were sketched rather than photographed, as the equipment required for outdoor photography in low-light conditions was not practical for rapid deployment. These sketches and photographs became part of the growing archive of materials related to the case, but they provided no new insights. As weeks passed without an arrest, the criticism of the police intensified. The newspapers published editorials questioning their competence, suggesting that incompetence or corruption prevented them from catching the killer. The vigilance committees accused the police of not taking the crime seriously because the victims were prostitutes, women of no social standing whose deaths might be considered less important than the murders of respectable citizens. This accusation stung, not least because it contained some element of truth. Had the victims been middle-class women, the investigation would likely have received even more resources and attention. But the police were genuinely committed to solving the case, and the lack of progress stemmed from the difficulty of the investigation rather than any lack of effort. Political pressure mounted from every direction. The Home Secretary demanded daily updates. Members of Parliament raised questions in the House of Commons. The Queen herself expressed concern about the murders and the apparent inability of the police to prevent them. Sir Charles Warren found himself under such intense scrutiny that his position became untenable. He would resign from his post as Commissioner in November, though he claimed his resignation was unrelated to the Whitechapel case. Few believed him. The most frustrating aspect of the investigation was the complete lack of forensic evidence. Modern techniques for analysing blood, identifying fingerprints, or extracting useful information from trace materials did not yet exist. The police had only eyewitness testimony, physical evidence like the arranged items found near victims, and the medical opinions about the nature of the wounds. None of this pointed conclusively toward any individual. The killer left no personal belongings at the scenes, no distinctive footprints, no unique tools that might be traced to their owner. He was careful, controlled, and either lucky or extraordinarily knowledgeable about how to avoid detection. Suspects continued to be arrested and released in a rhythm that became almost routine. A man would be reported acting suspiciously, would be taken into custody, would be questioned, and would either provide an alibi that checked out or demonstrate that he had no connection to the crimes. The newspapers reported each arrest with breathless excitement, suggesting that the killer had finally been caught, and then quietly noted the release when it became clear that yet another investigation had led nowhere. The public grew cynical, and the police grew desperate. Some investigators began to suspect that they might never catch the killer unless he made a mistake or was caught in the act. The crimes were too carefully executed, the killer too cautious or clever, the environment too conducive to his methods. This realization, though rarely stated openly, infected the morale of the investigation. Detectives continued their work with professional diligence, but the hope that had driven the early stages of the case had dimmed considerably. They were no closer to identifying the killer than they had been after the first murder, despite the accumulation of evidence and witness statements and suspect interviews. In the lodging houses and on the street corners, the women of Whitechapel watched the investigation falter with grim recognition. They had never expected the police to protect them. The police had always been adversaries rather than protectors, more likely to arrest a prostitute for solicitation than to concern themselves with her safety. The fact that the investigation had consumed so many resources was surprising, but the lack of results was not. The killer was one of their own, or at least one of the thousands who walked these streets, and he understood how to move invisibly through the East End in ways that no outsider could fully grasp. October advanced toward November, and the fog grew thicker, and the rain fell with increasing frequency. The investigation continued, following its established patterns, pursuing leads that would ultimately dissolve into nothing. And somewhere in the darkness, the killer remained free, his identity protected by his caution, his silence, and the simple, overwhelming complexity of trying to find one man among hundreds of thousands in the sprawling maze of London's East End. The net had been cast wide, but the fish had slipped through every mesh. Chapter 10. Mary Jane Kelly. November brought with it a cold that settled into the bones and refused to leave. The fog that had characterized October gave way to clearer skies, but temperatures that drove the poor deeper into their misery. In the lodging houses, tenants huddled around inadequate fires, burning whatever fuel they could afford or scavenge. In the streets, the wind cut through worn clothing and reminded every person that winter was approaching, that season of maximum danger when cold and hunger killed as surely as any blade. The murders had not stopped, but perhaps they had paused. More than a month had passed since the double event, and no new victims had been discovered. Some began to hope that the killer had finished his work, had fled London, had perhaps died or been institutionalized. Others knew better than to allow hope to take root. Mary Jane Kelly was younger than the previous victims, perhaps 25 years old, though she claimed various ages depending on whom she was speaking to and what story she was telling. She had been born in Ireland, had come to London as a young woman, and had worked as a prostitute for several years. Those who knew her described her as attractive, with blonde hair and blue eyes, standing about 5 feet 7 inches tall. She was known to drink heavily and to become loud and argumentative when drunk, but she could also be charming and friendly when sober. She lived at number 13 Miller's Court, a small room accessed through a narrow passage off Dorset Street. Miller's Court was a wretched place even by the standards of Whitechapel. The court itself was little more than a passage barely wide enough for 2 people to pass, opening off Dorset Street through an arched entrance marked with the number 26. Along this passage stood several buildings, subdivided into tiny rooms that were rented by the week or by the night. Mary Jane's room was on the ground floor, approximately 12 feet square, with a single window facing the court and a door that opened directly into the passage. The window had been broken at some point and had been patched with rags and cardboard. The furnishings were minimal: a bed, a table, a couple of chairs, nothing more. She lived there with a man named Joseph Barnett, a fish porter who had been providing for her and keeping her off the streets for some months. But Barnett had lost his job, and without income he could not pay the rent or support them both. They had quarrelled, arguments fueled by drink and frustration and the grinding pressure of poverty. Barnett had moved out on October the 30th, leaving Mary Jane alone in the room with rent owing to the landlord John McCarthy, who owned several properties in the court and along Dorset Street. McCarthy was a tolerant landlord by the standards of the time, willing to allow tenants to fall behind on their rent within reason. But his patience had limits. The night of November 8th was cold and damp with intermittent rain that kept most people indoors or hurrying quickly to their destinations. Mary Jane was seen by several people throughout the evening, drinking in the public houses along Commercial Street, speaking with acquaintances, attempting to earn money to pay her rent arrears. A woman named Mary Ann Nichols, who lived in Miller's Court, saw her return to her room around midnight accompanied by a man. Cox heard Mary Jane singing in her room afterward, a song called "A Violet I Plucked from My Mother's Grave," and the singing continued until approximately 1 o'clock in the morning. After that, silence settled over Miller's Court. What happened in that small room during the hours before dawn would prove to be the most horrific crime in the series. The killer had finally found what the previous murders had denied him: time and privacy. No one would interrupt him here. No policeman would pass by on his beat. No carter would drive his wagon into a yard at an inopportune moment. The door could be locked, though Mary Jane's door was never locked because the lock was broken. But the room itself was enclosed, isolated, and the night was long enough for everything the killer wished to do. The morning of November 9th brought rain and cold winds that drove people to wrap their coats tighter and hurry along the streets with heads down. At Miller's Court, the landlord's assistant, Thomas Bowyer, was sent to collect the rent that Mary Jane owed. It was just after 10:30 when he walked through the passage and knocked on the door of number 13. There was no answer. He knocked again, harder, and still received no response. The curtain that had been hung over the broken window was pulled across, blocking any view inside, but Bowyer pushed it aside and peered through the gap in the glass. What he saw caused him to stumble backward, his mind refusing at first to process the images his eyes had conveyed. He ran from the court, found McCarthy the landlord, and gasped out something about blood and murder. McCarthy came back with him to the room, looked through the window himself, and immediately sent Bowyer to fetch the police. Within minutes, Inspector Walter Beck arrived, followed shortly by other officers, including Inspector Aberlane. They broke down the door and entered the room, and what they found there would haunt every man who saw it for the remainder of his life. Mary Jane Kelly lay on the bed, or rather what remained of Mary Jane Kelly occupied that space. The killer had taken hours with his work, and he had been thorough beyond any previous crime. Her throat had been cut down to the spine, nearly decapitating her. Her face had been mutilated beyond recognition, slashed repeatedly until the features were unidentifiable. Her abdomen had been opened completely, the organs removed and scattered around the room. Her heart was missing entirely, taken away by the killer. Her thighs had been stripped of flesh down to the bone. The walls were splashed with blood. The remains of her clothing had been piled on a chair. A fire had been burning in the grate with such intensity that it had melted the spout of a kettle, and the fire appeared to have been fed with some of Mary Jane's clothing, burned to provide light for the killer to see his work. The scene was photographed, the first time such documentation had been done at an actual crime scene, rather than in the mortuary. The photographs would become some of the most disturbing images in the history of criminal investigation, too graphic to be shown to the public, but preserved in the police files. Dr. Thomas Bond conducted the post-mortem examination and provided a detailed report that catalogued the full extent of the mutilations. He estimated that the entire attack would have taken at least 2 hours, possibly longer, representing a level of sustained violence that exceeded anything seen in the previous murders. The news of Mary Jane Kelly's murder spread through Whitechapel like a shockwave. This was different from the others, not just in degree but in kind. The previous victim had been killed in open spaces or semi-public areas where the killer worked quickly and fled immediately. But Mary Jane had been killed in her own room, in a space where the killer could take his time and complete his ritual without interruption. The implications were terrifying. If he could spend hours with a victim, if he could work undisturbed in a locked room, if he could escalate to this level of violence, then what limits existed on what he might do? The investigation intensified yet again, though by now the police were going through motions that had proven fruitless before. Witnesses were interviewed about anyone seen near Miller's Court on the night of the murder. The man Mary Ann Nichols had seen with Mary Jane was described as short and stout, wearing dark clothing and carrying a pail, but this description matched thousands of men in the East End, and no one could be found who admitted to being that person. Other witnesses reported seeing Mary Jane at various times during the night, sometimes alone, sometimes with different men, though these sightings may have been cases of mistaken identity or confused chronology. The inquest was held at Shoreditch Town Hall, with Dr. Roderick MacDonald presiding as coroner. The proceedings were brief, almost perfunctory, as if the authorities recognised that no amount of testimony would lead to the killer's identification. Joseph Barnett testified about his relationship with Mary Jane, his recent departure from her room, his shock and grief at her death. The medical evidence was presented in sanitised form, sparing the jury and the public the full horror of what had been found in the room. The verdict was murder by person or persons unknown, the same conclusion that had been reached at every previous inquest. In the aftermath of Mary Jane Kelly's murder, the character of the investigation began to shift. Some detectives started to believe that this would be the final murder, that the killer had achieved whatever goal he had been pursuing and would now cease his activities. The escalation from the previous crimes to this ultimate horror suggested a culmination, a completion of some terrible purpose. Others disagreed, arguing that the killer had demonstrated his ability to operate with impunity and would certainly kill again when the impulse struck him. But as the days passed into weeks and the weeks into months, and no new victims appeared, the first theory began to seem more plausible. The funeral of Mary Jane Kelly took place on November the 19th, and it became a public spectacle that demonstrated how the murders had captured the imagination of London. Thousands of people lined the streets to watch the cortege pass, a level of attention that none of the previous victims had received. The crowd was so large that police had to create barriers to control the flow of people. Flowers were sent from all over the country. The burial at Leytonstone Cemetery was conducted before a crowd of mourners who had never known Mary Jane in life, but who felt connected to her through the horror of her death. The public attention given to Mary Jane Kelly's funeral highlighted something that had been building throughout the series of murders. The victims had become symbols rather than individuals, representatives of a class of women whose lives had never mattered to respectable society, but whose deaths now carried enormous weight. The newspapers published sentimental accounts of their lives, transforming them into tragic heroines, victims of both the killer and the social conditions that had forced them onto the streets. This narrative was not entirely false, but it simplified complex lives into simple morality tales, erasing the actual women in favour of the stories that could be built around them. November passed into December, and the fear that had gripped Whitechapel began to loosen slightly. The police presence remained high, but no new murders occurred. The women who walked the streets remained vigilant, but the immediate terror of the previous months began to fade into a general wariness. The investigation continued, with detectives still following leads and interviewing suspects, but the urgency had diminished. The case files grew no thicker. The breakthrough that might have led to the killer's identification never materialised. Mary Jane Kelly would be remembered as the final canonical victim of Jack the Ripper, though some investigators would later claim that other murders bore his signature. But whether he killed again or not, whether he died or fled or simply ceased his activities, the murder of Mary Jane Kelly represented the culmination of the Whitechapel murders. Everything he had been building toward had been achieved in that small room in Miller's Court. The pattern was complete, the ritual was finished, and London was left to grapple with the knowledge that the most notorious killer in its history had never been caught, never been identified, never been brought to justice. The room in Miller's Court was eventually cleaned and rented to another tenant, because rooms were scarce, and poverty did not pause for tragedy. The bloodstains on the walls were covered with fresh whitewash. The door was repaired. Life continued because it had no choice, but the memory of what had happened there remained, whispered about in the lodging houses, discussed in the public houses, retold to newcomers as a cautionary tale about the dangers that lurked in the shadows of Whitechapel. The darkness had reached its deepest point, and now, slowly, it began to recede. Chapter 8. The City of Suspects. The murder of Mary Jane Kelly transformed London into a city that viewed itself with suspicion. In the days and weeks following that November morning, when the full horror of what had been discovered in Miller's Court became known to the public, a collective paranoia settled over the East End and radiated outward into the surrounding districts. Every man became a potential suspect in the eyes of his neighbours. Every stranger attracted hostile attention. Every foreigner, every eccentric, every person whose behaviour deviated even slightly from the expected norm found themselves subject to scrutiny that could turn violent without warning. The city had always contained divisions between rich and poor, native and immigrant, respectable and fallen, but now these divisions deepened into chasms of fear and accusation. The foreign population of Whitechapel bore the brunt of this suspicion. The East End had become home to thousands of immigrants in recent decades, particularly Jews fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe. They spoke different languages, practiced different customs, dressed differently, worshipped differently, and these differences made them convenient targets when the native population sought someone to blame for the horrors occurring in their midst. The fact that no evidence connected any immigrant to the murders did not matter. Suspicion required no evidence, fear required no proof. In the public houses and on the street corners, men muttered about foreigners bringing their savage ways to England, about strange rituals and blood sacrifices, about alien practices that respectable Englishmen could not comprehend. Violence erupted sporadically throughout the autumn. Jewish shopkeepers found their windows broken, their doors daubed with threats and obscenities. Men walking home from synagogue were accosted by mobs demanding to know where they had been on the nights of the murders. The police attempted to protect the immigrant population, but they were vastly outnumbered by the angry crowds, and some among the police force shared the prejudices of the general population. The newspapers, to their credit, occasionally published editorials condemning the persecution of innocent people, but these measured voices were drowned out by the sensational coverage of the murders and the publication of theories that implicitly or explicitly blamed foreigners for the crimes. One name that circulated widely was that of Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jew who lived in Whitechapel and worked as a hairdresser. Kosminski suffered from some form of mental illness, possibly schizophrenia, and his behaviour was erratic enough to attract attention. He was known to wander the streets at odd hours, talking to himself, exhibiting the disconnection from reality that characterised his condition. The police investigated him as a potential suspect, and some officers became convinced of his guilt. Though no evidence beyond his suspicious behaviour and foreign origin connected him to the murders, he would eventually be committed to an asylum, where he would spend the rest of his life, and decades later some theorists would claim he was Jack the Ripper, though this claim rested on circumstantial evidence and the prejudices of the investigators rather than any concrete proof. Medical men came under particular scrutiny, as the theory that the killer possessed anatomical knowledge remained popular despite the lack of evidence supporting it. Any doctor who lived or worked in the East End found himself subject to investigation, his movements on the nights of the murders examined, his patients questioned, his character assessed. Some physicians faced accusations from patients or neighbours who had convinced themselves that some aspect of the doctor's behaviour indicated guilt. Dr. John Williams, who worked at the London hospital, was suspected by some. Dr. Thomas Neil Cream, who would later be executed for poisoning multiple victims, was accused by those who did not realise he had been in prison in America during the Whitechapel murders. Dr. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor who was in London during the murders, was investigated and briefly detained before fleeing to the United States. The idea that the killer might be a gentleman, someone from the upper classes slumming in the East End for perverse entertainment, captured the imagination of both the press and the public. This theory suggested that the murderer could afford to travel to Whitechapel from more respectable neighbourhoods, could commit his crimes and then return to his comfortable lodgings, where he would never be suspected. The appeal of this theory was obvious. It allowed the working classes to view the murders as an attack by the privileged upon the vulnerable, while simultaneously allowing the middle classes to fantasize about the dark secrets that might lurk behind respectable facades. Various names were whispered in connection with this theory, though most were based on gossip rather than evidence. Montague John Druitt entered the list of suspects posthumously after his body was recovered from the Thames in December 1888. Druitt had been a barrister and schoolmaster who suffered from depression and had killed himself, leaving behind notes that suggested mental instability. Some investigators became convinced that Druitt was Jack the Ripper, pointing to the fact that the murders ceased around the time of his death. But Druitt had been in Dorset, not London, on the date of at least one of the murders, and his suicide appeared to be motivated by personal and professional failures rather than guilt over serial murder. Nevertheless, his name would remain on the list of suspects for over a century, evidence of how desperate the investigation had become and how willing people were to identify anyone as the killer if it meant achieving closure. The theory that the murders were connected to a royal conspiracy emerged in later years, though it had no basis in fact and was contradicted by all available evidence. This theory suggested that Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence and grandson of Queen Victoria, had been involved either as the killer himself or as a client of Mary Jane Kelly, and that the murders were carried out to eliminate witnesses to some scandal involving the royal family. The theory was elaborate and involved multiple conspirators, including the royal physician Sir William Gull, and required ignoring the fact that Prince Albert Victor was nowhere near London during most of the murders. But the appeal of a royal conspiracy proved irresistible to those who wanted to believe that the murders were part of some grand plot, rather than the work of a lone killer. Local men who exhibited any unusual behaviour found themselves accused by their neighbours. George Hutchinson, who claimed to have seen Mary Jane Kelly with a well-dressed man on the night of her murder, came under suspicion himself, with some theorists suggesting that his detailed description of the supposed client was actually a description of himself, a psychological projection meant to deflect suspicion. Joseph Barnett, Mary Jane's former partner, was investigated as a potential suspect, though his grief appeared genuine and he had alibis for at least some of the murders. James Maybrick, a Liverpool cotton merchant who would die of arsenic poisoning, was later claimed to have been Jack the Ripper, based on a diary that most experts consider to be a forgery created decades after the murders. The most disturbing aspect of this city of suspects was how readily people were willing to believe the worst about those around them. Neighbours who had lived peacefully beside one another for years suddenly viewed each other with suspicion. A man who kept irregular hours, who was seen in the wrong part of town at the wrong time, who had blood on his clothing from perfectly innocent causes, any of these could trigger accusations that might lead to mob violence. The police received hundreds of tips from citizens reporting suspicious individuals, and each tip had to be investigated no matter how unlikely or absurd. The entire mechanism of society in the East End became oriented around the search for the killer, with everyone watching everyone else, trust eroding into paranoia. The lodging house keepers became informal investigators, observing their tenants with new attention, noting who came and went at unusual hours, who washed blood from their hands in the communal sinks, who kept to themselves and avoided conversation. Some keepers reported their observations to the police, leading to investigations that inevitably revealed innocent explanations. The blood was from a cut sustained at work, the irregular hours were due to night shift employment, the solitary behaviour was simply the preference of someone who valued privacy. But the atmosphere of suspicion persisted, making the lodging houses even more uncomfortable than they had been before. Women who survived encounters with aggressive or violent clients now reported these incidents to the police, convinced that they had narrowly escaped becoming the next victim. The police investigated each report, though distinguishing between ordinary violence against prostitutes and an actual encounter with the murderer proved impossible. The sad truth was that the women of Whitechapel faced violence regularly from their clients, and most of these violent men were not Jack the Ripper, but simply cruel or drunken customers who viewed the women as less than human and therefore legitimate targets for abuse. The investigation files filled with accounts of near misses and suspicious encounters that led nowhere. The vigilance committees that had formed after the early murders intensified their activities, patrolling the streets in greater numbers, establishing checkpoints where they demanded that men account for their presence in the district. These committees operated with quasi-official sanction, though their methods sometimes crossed the line into vigilantism. Men who could not provide satisfactory explanations for their movements were detained and turned over to the police, who were obligated to investigate even when the accusations had no foundation. The tension between these self-appointed guardians and the official police force created additional complications in an already complex investigation. The newspapers continued to publish theories about the killer's identity, with different publications favouring different suspects. The coverage became increasingly sensational, with artists creating lurid illustrations of the murders and the supposed killer, their images more influenced by imagination than evidence. These illustrations typically depicted the killer as a dark, hunched figure with a cloak and a knife, a visual representation that owed more to theatrical conventions than to any actual description provided by witnesses. But these images became embedded in the public consciousness, creating an iconography of Jack the Ripper that would persist long after the murders ceased. Some theorists suggested that the killer might be a woman, arguing that a female murderer could approach the victims without arousing suspicion, and that the assumption of male guilt might be blinding the investigation to other possibilities. This theory found little support among the police, who pointed to the strength required for some of the attacks and the apparent anatomical knowledge suggested by the mutilations. But the theory persisted in some quarters, evidence of how desperate people had become for any explanation that might make sense of the senseless. The most painful aspect of the investigation was how it revealed the class divisions that structured Victorian society. When the police investigated suspects from the upper or middle classes, they did so with deference and careful attention to propriety. When they investigated suspects from the working classes or immigrant communities, they often employed methods that bordered on harassment, detaining men on minimal evidence, holding them in custody for extended periods, treating them as guilty until proven innocent. This disparity in treatment did not go unnoticed by the residents of the East End, who pointed out that had the victims been wealthy women from respectable families, the investigation would have been conducted with far greater urgency and competence. As winter deepened and no new murders occurred, the immediate panic began to subside, but the suspicion remained. The city had been transformed by the murders, its social fabric torn in ways that would take years to repair. The foreign population of Whitechapel lived under a cloud of suspicion that would not fully lift for decades. The mentally ill and the eccentric faced increased persecution, viewed as potential threats rather than individuals deserving of compassion. And every man who walked the streets after dark knew that he might be viewed by others as a potential killer, that his presence alone could trigger fear or accusation. The list of suspects grew longer with each passing year as new theories emerged and old theories were recycled. Investigators retired or died, taking their suspicions and theories with them. Some convinced they had identified the killer but unable to prove it, others admitting that the case remained as mysterious as it had been from the beginning. The files accumulated in the archives at Scotland Yard, growing thicker but no more conclusive, a monument to the most extensive investigation in the history of British criminal justice and its ultimate failure to achieve its goal. The fog rolled through the streets of Whitechapel as it always had, obscuring vision, distorting sound, transforming familiar neighbourhoods into alien landscapes. And in that fog, everyone remained a potential suspect, everyone a possible killer, and the truth remained as hidden as it had been from the beginning. Chapter 9. The Silence That Followed. The months after Mary Jane Kelly's murder unfolded in a strange atmosphere of expectation and dread. The pattern established by the previous killings suggested that another murder would occur within days or weeks. The killer had demonstrated repeatedly that he was not satisfied, that his compulsion drove him to return to the streets again and again, but December passed without incident. The Christmas season arrived, bringing with it the usual mixture of religious observance and secular celebration, though the festivities in Whitechapel were muted by poverty and the shadow of recent events. The police maintained their heightened presence in the district, constables walking their beats through the cold nights, their breath visible in the lamplight, their eyes scanning the streets for any sign of suspicious activity. January arrived with bitter cold and snow that transformed the filthy streets into something briefly beautiful before the soot and grime reasserted their dominion. The lodging houses were fuller than usual as people sought shelter from the weather, willing to pay their pennies for a bed rather than risk freezing to death in doorways or alleys. The women who worked the streets found fewer customers during the coldest nights. Men hurried home rather than lingering in the cold, and even desperate poverty could not entirely overcome the survival instinct to seek warmth. Still no new murders occurred. The investigation continued, but with diminishing intensity as other crimes demanded police attention and resources. February brought a thaw, and with it came renewed fear. The weather that had kept people indoors was lifting. The streets were filling again with the usual traffic of the East End. If the killer had been waiting for more favourable conditions, this would be his moment to strike. The newspapers published articles speculating about when the next murder would occur, some suggesting that the killer had been deterred by the increased police presence, others arguing that he was simply biding his time. The women of Whitechapel walked the streets with the old vigilance renewed, watching for the warning signs they had learned to recognise, though those signs had proven useless in identifying the killer before. But no murder came. March arrived, and then April, and the spring of 1889 brought renewal to the city and a slow relaxation of the terror that had gripped the East End. The police presence began to decrease as resources were redirected to other concerns. The vigilance committees gradually disbanded, their members returning to their ordinary lives, no longer willing to spend their nights patrolling streets where nothing seemed to be happening. The newspapers moved on to other stories, political scandals, foreign wars, the endless cycle of news that filled their pages. The murders of the previous autumn began to recede into memory rather than remaining immediate threats. Some murders did occur in the East End during this period, as they always had in a district where violence was common and life was cheap. In July of 1889, a woman named Alice Mackenzie was found dead in Castle Alley, her throat cut and her abdomen bearing some injuries. The police investigated whether this might be another Ripper killing, but the differences from the previous murders were significant enough that most investigators concluded it was unrelated. The cuts were less precise, the mutilations less extensive, the overall character of the crime different from the pattern established in the autumn of 1888. Other bodies were discovered in subsequent months. Francis Coles in 1891, whose throat was cut but who bore no other injuries, but these two seemed to be separate as crimes, the work of different hands. The question that haunted the investigation was simple and unanswerable. Why had the murders stopped? Various theories emerged to explain the silence. Some suggested that the killer had died, perhaps of natural causes or by his own hand. Montague John Druitt's suicide in December 1888 seemed to coincide with the cessation of the murders, and some investigators seized upon this as evidence that he had been the killer. But the theory was circumstantial at best, and many doubted that Druitt, a failed barrister with no history of violence, had been capable of the Whitechapel murders. Others theorized that the killer had been institutionalized, committed to an asylum for reasons unrelated to the murders, but resulting in his removal from the streets. Aaron Kosminski was eventually committed to an asylum, and some pointed to this as proof that he had been the killer, though his commitment came years after the murders had ceased. The theory that institutionalization explained the silence was attractive because it accounted for why the murders stopped without requiring that the killer had died or left London. But it rested on the assumption that the killer's mental state would have deteriorated to the point of requiring commitment, an assumption that had no basis in evidence. The possibility that the killer had emigrated, fleeing London for another country, found support among some investigators. Francis Tumblety had left England for America shortly after the murders, and some American newspapers reported similar unsolved murders in the United States that bore resemblances to the Whitechapel killings. But the American murders were not similar enough to constitute a clear pattern, and the theory that Tumblety was the Ripper rested more on his suspicious behaviour and abrupt departure than on any concrete evidence. Nevertheless, the emigration theory remained popular because it explained the silence while maintaining the possibility that the killer had continued his work elsewhere, beyond the reach of British investigators. Some theorists suggested that the killer had achieved whatever goal he had been pursuing and simply stopped. This theory implied a level of purpose and control that seemed at odds with the apparent savagery of the crimes, but it accounted for the sudden cessation without requiring death, institutionalization, or emigration. Perhaps the killer had been conducting some dark experiment and had gathered the data he required. Perhaps he had been working out some psychological compulsion that had finally been satisfied. Perhaps the escalation that culminated in the murder of Mary Jane Kelly represented the completion of a process rather than a step along an infinite path. The theory was impossible to prove or disprove, but it suggested that the killer might still be walking the streets of London, recognizable as the monster who had terrorized the East End, living out his life in obscurity while his crimes passed into legend. The most disturbing possibility was that the murders had not actually stopped, but had simply changed in character sufficiently that they were no longer recognized as the work of the same hand. The Whitechapel murders had been distinctive in their savagery and in the pattern they established, but a killer who could exercise such control might also be capable of modifying his methods to avoid detection. Perhaps he continued to kill, but with less obvious mutilation, or in different locations, or using different methods entirely. This theory suggested that the apparent silence was illusory, that somewhere in London or beyond, the killing continued in forms that did not trigger the same recognition or response. The investigation never officially closed. Files remained open at Scotland Yard, and detectives continued to follow up on tips and theories for years after the murders ceased. Every few months or years, a new suspect would emerge, someone who had confessed on his deathbed, someone whose papers contained suspicious references, someone whose movements coincided with the dates of the murders. Each suspect was investigated, and each investigation led to the same conclusion: possible but not proven, suspicious but not conclusive, a theory that could not be eliminated but could not be confirmed. The victims themselves began to fade from memory, replaced by the growing legend of Jack the Ripper. The names of Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly were remembered primarily in connection with how they died rather than how they lived. Their individual stories, the complex paths that had led them to the streets of Whitechapel, the hopes and disappointments and small pleasures that had made up their lives, all of this was forgotten in favour of their roles as victims of the most notorious killer in British history. They became symbols, representatives of a class of women whose lives had never mattered to respectable society, but whose deaths had captured the imagination of the nation. The East End itself began to change slowly in the years following the murders. Social reformers used the publicity surrounding the case to draw attention to the conditions in the slums, arguing that poverty and overcrowding created environments where such horrors could occur. New housing was built, old rookeries were torn down, sanitation improved gradually. The transformation was slow and incomplete, and poverty remained endemic in the district for decades. But the murders had forced London to acknowledge what it had previously preferred to ignore: that within the greatest city in the world, thousands lived in conditions that bred desperation and violence. The silence that followed the murders was perhaps more unsettling than the murders themselves. During the autumn of 1888, the city had at least understood what it was facing: a killer who struck with predictable regularity, whose methods were known even if his identity remained hidden. But the silence offered no such clarity. It might mean the danger had passed, or it might mean the danger had simply changed form. The residents of Whitechapel could not know whether to relax their vigilance or maintain their caution. The uncertainty was in some ways more corrosive than the terror had been, because terror could at least be faced and endured, while uncertainty simply wore away at the spirit. The lodging houses continued to fill each night, and the women continued to walk the streets when necessity demanded, but the autumn of 1888 had taught lessons that would not be forgotten. Women were more careful about whom they approached, more likely to work in pairs, more conscious of their surroundings. The prostitutes of Whitechapel had always lived with violence as a constant companion, but now they understood that violence could take forms they had not previously imagined. The killer had not simply murdered them, he had transformed them into objects, canvases for his terrible art, specimens in some unknown experiment. That knowledge changed something fundamental about how they viewed their work and their lives. The police maintained their presence in the East End at levels higher than before the murders, though not at the peak reached during the autumn of 1888. Constables walked their beats, watched for suspicious activity, responded to reports of trouble. But the investigation had changed them as well. They had pursued the most intensive manhunt in the history of British policing and had failed to catch their quarry. Some felt this failure personally, as a mark against their competence and dedication. Others accepted it as an inevitable consequence of the difficulty of the case. Sometimes the criminal escaped, no matter how diligent the investigation. But all of them understood that the murders had revealed something about the limits of police work, about how a careful and intelligent criminal could operate with near impunity if he understood the environment and chose his victims carefully. The silence stretched from months into years, and still no definitive answer emerged. The case files at Scotland Yard grew dusty with age, consulted occasionally when some new theory arose, but never producing the breakthrough that might lead to a solution. The newspapers published retrospective articles on the anniversaries of the murders, reminding readers of the terror that had gripped London and speculating about why the killer had never been caught. Books were written analysing the crimes and proposing various suspects. The murders became part of London folklore, stories told to newcomers and to children as warnings about the dangers that lurked in the city's darker corners. But for those who had lived through the autumn of 1888, who had walked the streets when the killer was hunting, who had known the victims or had feared becoming victims themselves, the silence that followed was not the end of the story. It was simply another chapter, perhaps the longest and most frustrating chapter, in a narrative that would never achieve proper closure. The killer had walked among them, had killed with impunity, and had disappeared into whatever life he led when he was not murdering. And he had never been called to account, never been punished, never been forced to explain or justify or even acknowledge what he had done. The silence persisted, year after year, decade after decade, carrying forward into the new century and beyond. And in that silence, the legend grew larger than the truth, until it became difficult to separate fact from fiction, the real crimes from the mythology that had grown around them. The name Jack the Ripper became immortal, while the killer himself remained as unknown as he had been on that November morning when Mary Jane Kelly was found in her room in Miller's Court. The fog continued to roll through the streets of Whitechapel, and somewhere in that fog, perhaps, the answer remained hidden. Chapter 10. The Echo Through Time. The 20th century arrived with celebrations across London. Fireworks lighting the sky above the Thames, crowds gathering in Trafalgar Square to mark the passage into a new era. The Victorian age had ended with the death of the Queen in 1901, and with her passing came the sense that an entire epoch had closed. The Whitechapel murders belonged now to history rather than memory, though those who had lived through them still walk the streets of the East End, growing old, carrying with them knowledge of that terrible autumn that younger generations could only imagine. The district itself had changed in the intervening years, though not as dramatically as the reformers had hoped. Some of the worst slums had been cleared, replaced by new housing that was marginally better than what had come before. Sanitation had improved. Electric lighting was gradually replacing the old gas lamps, pushing back the darkness that had once made the streets so treacherous after nightfall. But poverty remained endemic, and the women who walked the streets still faced violence and exploitation, though perhaps not on the scale that had been common in the 1880s. The fundamental structures that had created the conditions for the murders, the grinding poverty, the lack of social support, the indifference of the comfortable classes, had not been eliminated, merely modified around the edges. The investigation files remained at Scotland Yard, periodically reviewed when new information emerged, or when old detectives returned to the case in retirement, unable to let go of the mystery that had consumed so much of their professional lives. Melville McNarton, who had become Assistant Chief Constable, wrote an internal memorandum in 1894 naming 3 suspects he considered most likely to have been the killer: Montague John Druitt, Aaron Kosminski, and a man called Michael Ostrog, whose criminal record included violence but whose connection to the murders was tenuous at best. The memorandum was not made public, but it represented the thinking of senior investigators about which suspects deserved the most serious consideration. The names of other suspects continued to surface periodically. In 1913, a journalist claimed that a man who had committed suicide in Buenos Aires had confessed to being Jack the Ripper, though investigation revealed the confession to be fabricated. In 1929, a novelist claimed that the real killer had been identified by a private investigator, but that the information had been suppressed to protect powerful interests. Each new claim generated newspaper coverage and public interest, but none withstood serious scrutiny. The truth remained as elusive as it had been in 1888. The victims themselves had been largely forgotten by the general public, their names known primarily to researchers and true crime enthusiasts. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly had been buried in paupers' graves, their funerals attended by crowds of sensation seekers rather than genuine mourners. No monuments marked their resting places. No plaques commemorated their lives. They had been poor women who died violently. And Victorian society had moved on from their deaths with the same indifference it had shown toward their lives. Only their connection to the famous killer kept their names alive at all, a grim immortality that reduced them to footnotes in someone else's story. The legend of Jack the Ripper grew throughout the 20th century, fed by books, films, television programs, and endless speculation. The case became a cultural phenomenon that transcended its origins as a series of unsolved murders in Victorian London. Writers used the killings as inspiration for fiction, creating versions of the killer that bore little resemblance to the scant facts known about the real crimes. Filmmakers produced dozens of movies featuring Jack the Ripper as a character, usually portrayed as a top-hatted gentleman stalking through fog-shrouded streets, an image that owed more to theatrical convention than historical accuracy. The murders became entertainment, transformed into stories that could be consumed safely by audiences who would never have to face the reality of what the victims experienced. Theories about the killer's identity proliferated with each passing decade. In the 1970s, a popular book claimed that Prince Albert Victor had been the killer, part of a royal conspiracy to eliminate witnesses to a scandal. The theory was thoroughly debunked by historians who pointed out that the prince had been nowhere near London during most of the murders, but the book sold millions of copies and the theory entered popular consciousness despite its factual inaccuracies. In the 1990s, a diary appeared claiming to have been written by James Maybrick, a Liverpool cotton merchant, confessing to the murders. Forensic analysis suggested the diary was a modern forgery, but debate about its authenticity continued among some enthusiasts. The development of modern forensic techniques raised hopes that the case might finally be solved through scientific analysis. DNA testing, unknown in the Victorian era, offered the possibility of identifying the killer if biological evidence could be recovered from the crime scenes or the victim's belongings. A shawl allegedly taken from the scene of Catherine Eddowes' murder became the subject of DNA analysis in the 21st century, with some claiming the results pointed to Aaron Kosminski as the killer. But the provenance of the shawl was questionable, the chain of custody unclear, and the DNA analysis itself was criticised by experts as methodologically flawed. The scientific evidence proved no more conclusive than the investigative work of the original detectives. The East End of London underwent dramatic transformation in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The old working-class neighbourhoods were gradually gentrified, with Victorian warehouses converted into expensive lofts, former slums rebuilt as fashionable addresses. The immigrants who had once faced persecution in these streets were replaced by new waves of immigrants from different countries, and then by young professionals seeking affordable housing near the financial district. The physical landscape that had witnessed the murders was largely erased, replaced by modern buildings that bore no connection to the past except their location. Only a few structures remained from the Victorian era, including some of the buildings that had stood during the murders, though even these had been renovated and repurposed beyond recognition. Tourism became an industry built around the murders. Walking tours traced the routes the killer might have taken, stopping at locations where the bodies were found, recounting the details of each murder for groups of visitors clutching cameras and guidebooks. The tours were popular, drawing people from around the world who wanted to walk the streets where Jack the Ripper had hunted. Some found this commercialization of tragedy distasteful, arguing that it disrespected the victims and transformed their suffering into entertainment. Others defended the tours as educational, claiming they served to keep history alive and to remember women who would otherwise be entirely forgotten. The debate reflected larger questions about how society should engage with dark history, whether such events should be commemorated, studied, or allowed to fade into obscurity. Museums and exhibitions featured artifacts related to the murders, displaying the letters allegedly written by the killer, photographs of the crime scenes, contemporary newspaper accounts. The Jack the Ripper Museum opened in London in the 21st century, devoted entirely to the murders and their investigation. The museum proved controversial, with critics arguing that it glorified a killer and commodified the suffering of his victims. Supporters contended that it preserved important history and educated visitors about Victorian society and the birth of modern criminal investigation. The museum remained open, attracting thousands of visitors annually, evidence of the enduring fascination with these crimes that had occurred more than a century earlier. Academic researchers continued to study the case, approaching it from various angles: criminological, sociological, historical. Dissertations were written analysing the impact of the murders on Victorian society, on the development of criminal investigation techniques, on attitudes toward poverty and prostitution. The crimes became case studies in criminal psychology, used to illustrate theories about serial killers and their motivations. But the academic work, for all its rigour and insight, could not answer the fundamental question that had driven the investigation from the beginning: who was Jack the Ripper? The identity remained unknown, and after more than a century, the likelihood of ever discovering the truth had diminished to near impossibility. The women who had died in the autumn of 1888 were finally remembered in their own right in the late 20th century, when researchers began to investigate their lives rather than focusing solely on their deaths. Books were published detailing what could be discovered about Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, where they were born, whom they married, what circumstances led them to the streets of Whitechapel. The picture that emerged was of complex individuals whose lives had been shaped by poverty, loss, addiction, and the limited options available to working-class women in Victorian England. They had been daughters, wives, mothers. They had had hopes and dreams before those hopes were ground down by the relentless machinery of survival in the East End. Remembering them as people rather than merely as victims represented a small measure of justice, though it came more than a century too late to matter to them. The question of why the murders continued to fascinate people was itself a subject of study. Psychologists suggested that the case appealed to fundamental human interests in mystery, danger, and the transgressive. The killer had never been caught, which meant the mystery remained open to speculation and imagination. The crimes were violent and sexual, touching on taboo subjects that both repelled and attracted attention. The Victorian setting provided distance that made the horror more palatable. These were crimes that happened long ago, in a world different from our own, to people whose lives bore little resemblance to modern experience. The fascination could be indulged safely, without confronting the reality of contemporary violence against women. But perhaps the deepest reason for the enduring interest was simpler and more unsettling. The murders represented a fundamental failure of justice, a demonstration that sometimes the guilty escape punishment, that sometimes evil operates with impunity, that sometimes there is no resolution or closure. This truth was uncomfortable, contradicting the narratives of justice and moral order that society preferred to believe. Jack the Ripper walked free, killed at least 5 women with apparent ease, and was never held accountable. He lived out whatever remained of his life without consequence, while his victims died in terror and were forgotten by all except those who studied the case. This failure haunted the investigation from the beginning and continued to haunt it more than a century later, a reminder that justice is not inevitable, that sometimes the darkness wins. The fog still rolled through the streets of London on autumn evenings, though the city it covered was vastly different from the Victorian metropolis where the murders occurred. The gas lamps were gone, replaced by electric lights that pushed back the darkness more effectively than any previous technology. The slums had been cleared, the worst poverty ameliorated if not eliminated. The police had tools and techniques that would have seemed like magic to the Victorian detectives who pursued Jack the Ripper through those fog-bound streets. But the fundamental mystery remained unsolved, and the echo of those terrible months in 1888 continued to resonate through time. The case files at Scotland Yard had been transferred to archives, preserved as historical documents rather than active investigations. Researchers could examine them, study the witness statements and autopsy reports and correspondence that had accumulated during the investigation. But the files contained no smoking gun, no overlooked clue that might finally identify the killer. Everything that could be learned from the physical evidence had been learned long ago. The investigation had been thorough and competent within the limitations of Victorian police work. If the killer remained unidentified, it was not because the detectives had failed in their duty, but because the killer had been careful, clever, and extraordinarily fortunate. The story of Jack the Ripper had no ending, only a trailing off into silence and speculation. The murders stopped, the investigation faltered, the case files grew cold, and the truth receded beyond the reach of discovery. The victims were buried and forgotten, remembered only as names attached to dates and locations, their individuality erased by their connection to the famous killer. The killer himself, whether he died or emigrated or simply ceased his activities, disappeared into the anonymity from which he had emerged. His identity protected by time and the destruction of evidence and the simple fact that the investigation had never come close to exposing him. And so the echo continued, generation after generation, the story retold and reimagined, the theories evolving, the fascination never quite fading. The autumn of 1888, when terror stalked the streets of Whitechapel, and 5 women died in ways that shocked the Victorian conscience, became part of the permanent mythology of London, of England, of the modern world. The name Jack the Ripper became more famous than any of the actual details of the case warranted, transformed from a serial killer into an archetype, a symbol of all the darkness that lurks in human nature and all the mysteries that remain forever unsolved. The candle had burned low, the chamber had fallen silent, and history once again had turned the page in the dark, leaving behind only questions that would never be answered, shadows that would never fully dissolve into light. The women who died deserved better, better than the lives they were forced to live, better than the deaths they suffered, better than the obscurity into which they faded. But they were given what Victorian society always gave to women of their class, nothing except suffering, and in the end, not even the dignity of justice. The fog rolled on through the streets of London, eternal and indifferent, and somewhere in that grey murk the truth remained hidden, perhaps forever.